Welcome to the Lone Wolf MTB podcast. Today, I hope you've drank your ginkgo biloba because this is an episode that has a lot of facts, theory, and technical data. We're gonna be talking to Peter Zawistowski, AKA Stretch of Yeti Bicycles, and we are going to be going deep into the weeds of suspension. We're gonna talk about all the buzzwords, all the bar systems, and you name it. If it has to do with how a bike squishes up and down, we're probably going to cover it. So dive into today's episode. Thanks again to Feedback Sports and Joe's No Flats for helping sponsor this episode and the podcast series. Check the link down below if you're looking for a work stand, some tools, or other bike care maintenance products. Thanks for watching and enjoy this episode. Stretch, thanks for sitting down and chatting with us, man. I know we did before we started a podcast, you and I had a pretty in-depth video talking about suspension. And I want to say that was at the LTE launch, like the first e-bike launch in Crested Butte?
Yeah, so that would have been 160E. So even before
160E,
the LTE.
that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really, I thought that was a really cool and fun conversation. I would say that I've met no shortage of people in the bike industry that are, as I affectionately call, suspension nerds. You're on the podium for sure.
I appreciate that for sure.
I love the conversations that we've had about suspension in the past. And at that time, obviously, we were talking about 160E and what you guys were doing with suspension there. At that point in time, was Sixfinity, I'd imagine that you must have been kind of in that space already, because I know you guys are working years ahead of time, right?
Yeah, I guess at that point, so 160E was Sixfinity, so it was our first launch of Sixfinity. But so yeah, we definitely thinking of it at that time, and there's a whole history we can get into if we want to on the background of the timing of Sixfinity. But yeah, we were certainly deeply involved with it at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And sorry, I guess to more clarify my question was, were you thinking about Sixfinity in a non-E application?
At that point, for sure. Yeah, it was something that we were doing in the background for quite some time. It's if we go back to the history of Sixfinity in general, it really started. It was about 2016 when that concept sort of broke through, and really the focus at that time was we knew we wanted to make an e-bike and we were interested in doing it, but we were just physically constrained on what we could do with Switchinfinity. So the task or the challenge that we had at that time was, how can we actually mimic and keep a lot of the properties that we had with Switchinfinity, but how can we do so with these big packaging constraints that we have with the drive unit and the battery and so on. And so that was, essentially kinematically, or the challenge was how can we actually achieve a lot of the similar characteristics of Switchinfinity, but in this different pivot locations and constraints that we would have. So that's really where it started, was back then. When we made our first prototype or mule of Sixfinity, it was in 2017. There's some pictures of the alloy mules that we had out there, I think, since the LT launch. But that was, we actually made a pedal version and an e-bike version at the same time. It was really helpful to have like a baseline and be able to compare the same suspension essentially with a drive unit and one without. So we could take out some of those, at least have some of it, what of a control, and understand what was happening with the suspension. So that was the start, was the very beginning. We had a pedal version just as a control, but the focus was on e-bikes. And that kind of really, over the years from 2017 until today, we have made quite a few prototypes and mules on Sixfinity pedal specifically.
Mm-hmm.
We've made I think it was 2019, we made essentially a comparable model of our SB130 at the time. So a trail bike version of the pedal. We made that actually out of carbon. We also made the DH bike that you see being raced right now, also Sixfinity pedal specifically. And then prior to the LT, we made yet another carbon tooled up mule to focus and really refine even further. So it's really been on the back of our minds, or something that we've been studying in parallel for quite some time, both pedal and E. Obviously, initially the pedal was our focus, and after all the prototyping that we did and playing around with both E and pedal, it became clear that it was there's a lot of advantages to going that direction.
So before we get maybe too deep into Yeti and Yeti project stuff, it'd be cool
Yeah,
to maybe take a step out and maybe talk to Stretch as a person.
yeah,
Um, if you could, I guess, design the ultimate suspension platform and package, and I know right now you're probably gonna say, "Oh, it's Sixfinity," but
mhm,
like, let's just say, like, somehow you travel to another dimension, and all the
yeah.
parameters and all the constraints are lifted. What do you envision that suspension platform looks like and acts like? And how what travel would you give a bike?
That's a yeah, lot to answer there. I guess I'd start with it's in the I think it's helpful to compare to reality when you have this kind of fun study or mind thought of what could happen. But right now, the way that it works is it's a huge kind of multi-dimensional puzzle of all these different variables that you're trying to optimize, and they all have they're all often directly related to each other. So if you change one, you're impacting the other, and there's varying degrees to how independent those variables are. And as we move to something from 4 bars to 6 bars, we can get into some of this as well. But we have more freedom and more flexibility to tune a variable with having less impact on another one. And so I think one of the analogies maybe I say it poorly, but I try to compare it to is, like maybe if our solution is a balloon, and like say it's a sphere and it's a balloon, all these variables, as you push one, and maybe our goal is to have a sphere, but as you push one variable, you're making this oblong shape. You push another one, you're pushing it in another direction, and they all affect each other. And so one of the things that we can do is think of ways to have less impact on that sphere, so that you change one variable, you're less impacting another one, and you're being able to optimize the whole solution. And there's lots of different variables that we're focusing on. So I think right now it's in reality, relative to kind of physics and what's occurring, is that it is this balance, and trying to weigh all those variables and also have a flavor of bike that's, in our case, a Yeti flavor, what we're going for, what we prefer, the terrain that we're riding, just what, selfishly what we desire, and trying to optimize for that. So in the perfect world that you're describing, essentially what would happen is you'd have complete independence of every single one of those variables, and you wouldn't have to tune one and consider the other one. You'd just be able to choose them all perfectly. And in addition to that, you'd be able to do that in a way that they're positioned so that you have a really cool looking bike as well, and a really structurally sound bike as well. So you have these kind of competing attributes of a bike, where a bike is unique compared to a lot of other products out there. Like, I think I compare it to a car or a vehicle quite a bit, where the structure is also the ID or the look of the bike, compared to like on a car, where you have your chassis and your sort of engineering nerdery, and then you're skinning it with this kind of whatever you want to do on the top, and they can be somewhat independent. But on a bike, the big challenge is that your aesthetic, your structure, and your performance are all tied together, and that's a big part of the challenge. So the perfect world answer would be, you could choose any form and shape that you wanted, and you can locate the pivots wherever you wanted, and still get the attributes you want on the performance side, and then all those attributes would be completely independent.
Yeah, yeah, that's spoken, I guess, like a true brain in there. So, if do you believe then that you could make a bike that performs drastically better, notably better than what is currently on the market? However, it would come at too big of a detriment to the physical appearance and the look of the bike?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a balance there. I think we've struck a really good balance of achieving both those things. And as you mentioned, kind of get back to Sixfinity, but I think we really have done a good job and gotten to a point where we're able to really achieve both really well. In theory, yeah, of course, there's always in that perfect world scenario that you could improve, and maybe how tangible it is maybe TBD. But yeah, I guess my answer to that would be, generally, I think in theory, yes, you could have some improvements. How tangible? I think those maybe some diminishing returns there, and we've gotten to a place that's really pretty sound at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be interesting if you're like, let's just take, for example, Nailed and the Square One
Hmm.
suspension. Remember that Marin and Polygon did
Yeah,
several
of
years
course.
back. Um, did you ever ride one of those bikes?
I never rode one. Definitely, obviously, had seen it and kind of analyzed it nerdy on my side, but I've never ridden one personally.
Upon analyzation, what were your thoughts about what it was doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like generally speaking, I think that's a topic we can bring up is that there's in the world of bikes and what people are designing for and what they're after, to some degree there's maybe no wrong answer. I think that there's lots of people that are doing different things and trying different things and exploring them and maybe optimizing for what they think is ideal. And that's the cool thing about bikes is that again, there's really no wrong or right answer to some degree. Of course, each person is going to have a preference on what they're
Yeah.
after and what flavor they're going for. So, I guess my answer to that would be that I could see the logic of kind of where their mind was. Maybe the science behind some of the thought process may not have been completely sound, but I think looking at what was mentally going on there and what they were trying to achieve, and then looking at maybe from a scientific perspective of what the curves were actually outputting, maybe tells a little bit of a different story. And then there's always trade-offs, not only in what these performance curves look like, meaning like NSY or NRIs or leverage rate, but also structurally, as we mentioned, not only aesthetics, what the bike needs to look like, but it also structurally needs to be sound. It needs to be, stiff in the right areas or strong enough. And there's this fine balance where you're trying to achieve all of those things. And I would say maybe in that particular case, maybe they were achieving some variables to a level that they were preferring, and if I had to guess, maybe others that they weren't. And I think that's part of the balance and the focus, especially on our side, is balancing all of those attributes to get something that's performing across that whole spectrum. So dynamically, structurally, and aesthetically. And then obviously add weight and cost and all these other things to it as well. But yeah, maybe that one aimed in certain directions and hit some, and maybe didn't hit others.
Yeah, yeah, and I really wonder. I mean, as a person who has ridden that, and I've known Daryl Voss for a very long time, and I mean, the guy's got no shortage of patents that people are using daily in the bike world, right?
Mhm.
I mean, he's a smart dude, but I can't help but think if that bike was built using a more traditional rear triangle instead of that elevated mono stay,
Mhm.
would that have addressed the visual appearance issues that were, I think, probably a deal breaker for many, and also maybe given some of the stiffness and rigidity that some riders wanted? Because, having talked to both pro athletes who raced it, as well as like myself and other editors who wrote it, I mean, it was undeniable that some of the benefits and the ride characteristics that the bike delivered. But that's kind of why I said, I was like, if you
Yeah.
could make a bike that was absolutely hideous, could you make a better suspension platform? Work, but at the same time, no matter if something's really unattractive,
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah. I
matter
think
how good it works.
a couple points to that is like for sure. I mean, it's we have all sorts of solutions that physically don't even work, right? Like might maybe have a pivot through your head tube or something. You're right. There's certainly solutions out there that just aren't viable, either aesthetically, structurally, and maybe they have awesome dynamic or kinematics that are resulting in good dynamics, but it's just not a possibility or an option. So yeah, for sure, in theory, like there's something that exists out there that would look obnoxious and maybe perform really well,
Yeah,
without a doubt. But I think that's the challenge and part of the fun. It's you're blending this engineering nerdery with art, to some degree, and trying to mash those together in something that is exciting from a performance standpoint and also exciting from a product and just visual standpoint. So I actually, it's fun to go down both directions. Maybe focus only on aesthetics and then maybe focus only on the performance on the kinematic side. But the real challenge, I think, is blending those two together and achieving both.
yeah,
But I think another comment too is on that particular bike you were speaking of is, we actually have a lot of experience with linear motion, and we've done quite a few bikes that have that type of a joint, with 303 and back in the day, and obviously what we do with Sixfinity. So a lot of those general ideas of using a different style of joint or a prismatic joint as opposed to a revolute joint. So fancy word to say a linear joint as opposed to a rotary joint, is something that we've obviously explored for some time and kind of reaped the benefits of that. And then, our kind of progression from there is other ways to achieve similar results, but taking out that linear joint.
yeah. Interesting. Now, something that like is kind of circling in my brain after you talked about automotive, right? Where you've got the engineering platform and the chassis, and
Mm-hmm.
then, you're covering it with, the wrap or the facade, right? The decorative element. Do you think that are bicycles too weight focused for you to ever have a spot where you could make a chassis, um, you know, and that has what you want designed, and then you make a carbon skin over it? Maybe there's holes for accessing hardware and stuff, or, I mean, like you see those prototype bikes that racers ride, and they just have like the bikini cover over the top, right? Like, do you think there's ever a possibility that that would work in the bike space?
I guess I'd never say never, but it's I think you nailed it on just generally one of the other big constraints, which is weight as well,
Yeah.
right? So it's by the time you maybe had that solution on the performance side of the structure, and then you add this facade, you're not really having a big gain,
Yeah.
between those two. So I would say, yeah, it's bikes are just unique in that particular space where, even moto is quite a bit different than a bike that you're pedaling around, and what the goals are, and so on. So I think we're pretty constrained on what the expectations are from a weight performance perspective. That I think that direction is maybe not super likely if I had to
Yeah.
take my stake on that.
Um, Now, kind of continuing down the looks and functionality point, I love the new LT. Absolutely pumped on that thing.
Awesome.
I I think am probably somewhat known for not being a huge fan of high anti-squat bikes. I've
Mhm.
kind of been called out for years of being critical of Santa Cruz VPP bikes and Intense, especially VPP bikes back in the day, and just saying that they're stiff, they were harsh off the top, and on chattery terrain they were just a bit rough and abusive. Um, we're seeing more and more brands going away from their trademarked, not literally just in terms of like the platform name, but trademark visibility, right? Yeti is one of those brands. I feel like so many people recognize them for the way their bikes looked, the Switch Infinity, and like I've seen a couple of comments about them saying like, "Oh, Yeti is making another boring, vertical shock bike now, like everybody else. They
Mhm.
lost personality." Um, I mean, can you talk about your thoughts as like a guy in suspension, as a mountain biker, right? First and foremost, like we're seeing brands going away from VPPs, what you guys were doing with Switch Infinity, going to Sixfinity, like, and again, I'm not really necessarily looking for validation of like my
Yeah.
critical reviews of products and how they rode me, right? Because like you said earlier, there's a right and wrong for everybody, and there are people who want a high anti-squat bike. But for me, I'm kind of like, oh, like our bikes getting a little more descending biased now. Why are people leaving these platforms that they've been on? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, geez, a lot to unpack. I guess I'd start with the comment that not going to a vertical layout shock is not innovation on our side, and I would definitely argue very much the opposite in terms of what we're doing relative to others in the industry. So, yes, it is a vertical layout shock, but our I would say that you're definitely unique in the industry for sure in terms of having a technology that is actually unique and innovative, and has really tangible benefits to it. And yes, we make the change from Switch Infinity to Sixfinity, but that is actually a big technological jump between those two. Even though it happens to have a vertical shock layout, but it's going from a 4-bar to a 6-bar, and also a very specific 6-bar in terms of our goals and how we're controlling it. So I would definitely argue that our focus, and Yeti in particular, has always been on innovation, and actually I feel from my perspective, a really big pressure relative to my position and just Yeti's history. So it's just something that we've always, Yeti as a brand has been really open to the idea of thinking outside the box and trying new ideas. And if you go back in history, all the way back in history, there's a huge tradition of that on the Yeti side, and I think in the earlier days, just the way that it was a lot of that innovation was kind of trial and error, and people were really figuring it out. There wasn't a great scientific method, call it in the '90s and even in the early 2000s. And I think since then, there's really been a lot stronger scientific approach about how to go about suspension design, and it's something that we really focus on strongly here, and are always continuing to learn and to better understand and approach it from a scientific method. So I guess my answer, yeah, generally speaking, I think actually we have a lot of innovation that's going on in Sixfinity, and I would argue relative to the industry, especially pedal and e platform that is unique and actually offering benefits. The other thing I think, your comment on just anti-squat in general, I think there's definitely some just confusion there and kind of what high anti-squat means and when it's good and when it's bad and those sorts of things. And I think on the LT in particular, so one thing to note is, it can be difficult to kind of determine how much information to divulge publicly relative to some of these curves, is because there's generally not a great understanding across the industry or consensus on media of what these terms even mean. And then you have to have some knowledge and background to really fully understand it. So I think one of the differences on the LT that maybe has some confusion is that historically, and for better or for worse, we've done this just to kind of simplify it for the community, but anti-squat is a family of curves, right? It depends upon which cog you're in your cassette.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a family of curves based off of what cog you're in your cassette. So oftentimes it's sort of easy to, you'll see like one curve for anti-squat. And I think that's really done in the industry, in the industry, just because it's kind of confusing and it's technical and it's easier just to kind of talk about one curve.
Yeah.
And so historically, we've sort of done that to some degree, where we kind of simplify and we say, hey, this is the general trend and the general magnitude and shape of the curve. But it is in fact actually a family of curves, and during the LT we showed that whole family of curves. And I think there's some confusion there where you're like, well, this is really high. And it's actually really similar and very much on par to what we did on the 160, so its predecessor.
Right.
So if you look at those values of the anti-squat, they're actually very much in sync to that bike. I think it's maybe called out more because people aren't used to seeing that whole family of curves and what those values are across the whole cassette.
Sure.
And Switch Infinity in particular, Switch Infinity and Sixfinity both have a relationship on their anti-squat where the anti-squat is actually higher when you go to a lower gear or to a smaller cog in the bike. And so you see that on paper and you're like, oh, that's really high. And I think there's a couple points to that are worth maybe going through. And one is that, that people often relate anti-squat to pedal kickback. That whole variable, and high anti-squat equals high pedal kickback. And while there is a relationship to pedal kickback with anti-squat, and this is very dependent upon the linkage and the drivetrain, do you have an idler, all these kind of other sub variables, but there is a relationship. But it's often actually not intuitive in some ways. So like, yes, the anti-squat is getting higher as you go to a higher gear in our case, or a lower, smaller cog. But pedal kickback actually decreases as you go to a smaller cog. So that shows you that relationship isn't always directly related. So there's I guess what I'm trying to say is there's more to the conversation and consideration than simplifying it down to a number or a value.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I'd add to that too is that when we're focusing on anti-squat and what that magnitude is, or that value, we are more focused on a pedal bike specifically about what that percentage is and the gears that you're more likely going to be climbing in.
Yeah.
And we're maybe less concerned in the gears that you're going to be descending in. And an e-bike might be a little bit different scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense for sure. And yeah, I mean, like you said, right, the second gear, like second easiest gear from the third gear from the hardest, are going to be very different applications of force when you're pedaling, right? And what you want the suspension to be acting like.
Yeah, and I think maybe just one more thing to add, and we talk about this quite a bit, and now it's sort of I think we've talked about it enough that it's maybe too much, but our anti-squat curves also are very specific and kind of the behavior, the shape, or the form that we're after, and what we're trying to achieve. So we yes, there are high anti-squat values. High you can use subjectively. But those are done and the higher values are around the sag point and the point that you're pedaling, and they're also very consistent across a band around sag. And what I mean by that is that you call it 30% sag, you can set your bike up to that as a starting point. But you know that when you're pedaling, you're kind of undulating between that 30%. You're not right at 30%. So
Yeah.
we're trying to have an anti-squat curve or a family of curves that's really consistent around a band around sag. It's not just at that exact point.
Right.
And we want that higher anti-squat value when you're pedaling to give you that pedaling platform. But then we're actually trying to decrease that anti-squat and are decreasing that anti-squat value really quickly after sag, so that we're sort of diminishing that effect of anti-squat or chain tension later in the travel where you don't need it.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially what you're saying then is that just anti-squat in and of itself isn't correlative to sensitivity, plushness, smooth feeling suspension.
For sure. I mean,
It's
it's
got
a
changes beyond sag.
yeah, it's a component, and I think it's really, really difficult, and it's something that we still are, after many years of working on bikes. I try to describe it as, you have these quantitative values that we're using as a way to scientifically compare even our own baseline, our own bikes, have some theory to work towards that's scientific. But then you have this qualitative side, and your mind can definitely convince you of things that maybe aren't scientifically true, right? So you have,
Yeah.
with anti-squat, for example, right? There's a lot of other variables that are at stake there or occurring at the same time for whatever the feeling you might be discussing, right? Your leverage rate is going to have a huge role. Your body position, your shock tuning, and then if someone can have a sensation that they're feeling on the bike and then be like, it's this variable specifically, I'd be very impressed because it's often against opposite of your intuition.
Right.
And then, even again, after years and years on our side, kind of really distilling which one of those variables at which time and which sensation that you're feeling, which one has a bigger weight to the problem or the sensation that you're feeling. It can definitely be different than I think where your intuition is. And those are the type of things that just take a lot of time and effort. Like on our side is, going through that history of our own products and our own writing, and then trying to correlate something quantitative and scientific to something qualitative and understanding those two. So I think there is for sure. I mean, we do it just at our own biases here. I do it all the time. I have this like idea of this is occurring because of this particular variable, and oftentimes I'm wrong. My intuition is wrong, and I think those type of things happen all the time when people are describing bikes, and it's not for it's just for it's difficult. Like I think it comes down to it being difficult to articulate what you're feeling and also accurately understand which variable is at play.
Yeah. What to
Um,
attribute that to.
yeah.
So if you were, given riders tips on like, hey, I want to buy a bike. And again, like, there could be two riders who live in Southern California or Bellingham. They're riding the same terrain, but they've got very different goals. They have different styles of riding.
Yeah.
So if a rider is thinking like, hey, I want to buy a 160 millimeter bike, right? I don't know if I want this suspension platform or this suspension platform. And maybe they're just more looking at brand. Maybe I want X brand or Y brand. To someone like me, I'm very, picky about what suspension platform I like and what I would love, and I shouldn't even say platform, what suspension feel I want or like out of a bike. And so with the numbers that are presented and given to the public, right? What would be your advice to people that are searching, like, what's going to be the most complementary to me, my style, and my terrain? Like, what's their checklist of things that they should be looking at?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of, so there's a potential rabbit hole we could go through, which might be fun. But so my perspective is, I get this quite a bit, and again, it's difficult to articulate maybe a qualitative feel to a quantitative feel. So my general technique, which is helpful for me, is to kind of lay a foundation on the quantitative side of, or where you can start, and then try to link those to the qualitative. But I think it's part of the problem maybe with the question that you have there. I think especially kind of just the way the industry portrays or shows information, is that it's kind of all over the place, and it's difficult to kind of understand maybe these classifications of suspension or kind of how things are working. And it's getting more complex as you get to 6 bars as well. And And there's sort of this old nomenclature, and it's just like this culturally, there's sort of this like shadow of confusion, I think, in general on how bikes can be, at least from like a basic level, classified to help maybe somebody understand at least maybe what that brand was thinking, what they were after, what they're able to tune, and then from there maybe what the feel that they're going after as well. But if if you want to humor me, we could go through that kind of just basic kind of foundation of some of these kinematic attributes, and that might help answer the question. And that I think it's something that we could refer to later in the conversation as well. Having like a bit of this background to then go back and be like, all right, here's the feel I'm going for. How could it possibly be achieved with the quantitative side? And that might be a good way to approach it.
I love it.
Okay, all right. So
And hopefully
I think,
the listeners will too.
yeah, hopefully it's not too boring, but we'll start it out and see where it goes. But
Okay.
I mean, I think it's to start out. I think you can kind of there's more divisions in this, but if you break up the problem of bike design and you have, let's say you have kinematics, you have vehicle dynamics, structure, and then maybe geometry are kind of maybe some of the leaders. Obviously, there's damping in the suspension side as well, but I think it's helpful to start on kinematics, generally speaking, and then also maybe to give some clarification on kinematics, the word, and also maybe how it's used in the industry as well. So I think also just culturally and the way the bike world has worked is that word is sort of used. Kinematics has been used like generally to talk about kinematics and talk about dynamics. And then in fact, they're actually really different fields and different steps along the way.
Mhm.
And so I think it's helpful to break down the problem by starting with kinematics and understanding what that means, and maybe going on later to dynamics, and we can get into some of those variables. But if you start with kinematics, it's really the study of the motion or geometry of the motion of a rigid body. Which the way to think about that is just we're assuming that the body that we're talking about, and a body is using interchangeably with the word link. So a link or a body is completely rigid. We're assuming it can't flex. It's totally rigid. And then these bodies are connected by joints. And when you have these bodies connected by joints, you create something called a kinematic chain. And it's just a mechanism. So you can name your mechanism a vice grip or something that is a linkage. And that's the starting point, is understanding that. Let's start there with kinematics and knowing that actually kinematics has no forces involved. You're not even thinking about forces at that point. All you're doing is looking at the geometry of the motion of these theoretically rigid things that are connected to each other, and how do they move in space when they're connected to each other. And so that's the starting point. And at those joints, there's different styles of joints. And on a bike suspension, we're typically talking about a planar linkage, so a linkage in 2 dimensions. It's not a 3-dimensional linkage. And we have different joints, and typically on a mountain bike, there's 2 different joints that we're focused on. There are others, but very unlikely on a mountain bike. So a revolute joint, which we talked about before, which is just think of it like a bearing, so a rotary joint. And then there's a prismatic joint, which is a fancy name to say a linear slider. So both the revolute and the prismatic joint have 1 degree of freedom. So they are constrained to 1 degree of freedom. And what we're trying to do on a mountain bike is create a mechanism that has also 1 degree of freedom. And that's like the starting point. So what I mean by that is, I can talk about this in a few different ways, but basically there's an input to the linkage and an output to the linkage. And on a mountain bike, you can think of maybe the input as your wheel path, or the motion of your wheel, and maybe the output is your motion of the joint that's basically moving the shock or connected to the shock. And you could flip that if you wanted to, but that's the way I typically talk about it. And we know that if you choose any point on that linkage and on a bike, it's going to be constrained as you move through the travel. It's going to be constrained to 1 degree of freedom. And the way to think about that is that, let's take the wheel, for example. As you go through the travel, that wheel is constrained to a spline or to an arc. It's a line that in space that's migrating, that point is migrating through. It's not, your wheel isn't migrating through an area or a volume. It's got 1 degree of freedom. And same with the shock. And so what we can do from a scientific perspective is there's a basically something called the mobility criterion. So we can look at the joint type, and there's some nerdery math behind it, and then the number of links. And then there's this theorem that basically describes well, what is your mobility value when you put it through this theorem? And that mobility is essentially the degree of freedom that the system has. So we can say this bike has X number of links or bodies and X number of this type of joint and X number of this type of joint. In the end, what degree of freedom is the system going to have? And in the bike world, we're constrained that we want to have 1 degree of freedom. So we only have a certain solutions that are going to work for mountain bike suspension. And if you go to the very basics, you can say, all right, a single pivot bike, right? You have a front triangle and a swing arm. And one thing to think about there is that I think isn't really well understood is that your front triangle is considered as one of the links. So a single pivot bike is actually a 2-bar system. So it has 2 bars or 2 links, 2 bodies, and 1 joint. And if you go through that mobility criterion, you get a value of 1. You have a mobility of 1. On a 4-bar is our next kind of step up. And then in that case, you have 4 bars or 4 bodies and 4 joints. And that's the number of bodies and joints you need to have 1 degree of freedom. And you can bump yourself up then to 6-bar, and you have 6 bars and 7 joints. And that's what's required to have 1 degree of freedom. So those are like from a very basic level, and we can talk about different flavors of that, but you have a 2-bar, which is usually called a single pivot. You have a 4-bar and you have a 6-bar. There's higher values from there that probably aren't worth discussing, but I think the point there is that we have like a very easy way to classify these systems. And we'll get into that here in a minute, but that's like the first step. Design a linkage that has 1 degree of freedom. And then that's your starting point, and we can prove with math which one is going to have 1 degree of freedom. And then the next step from there is understanding basically something called your instant centers. So there's lots of different names for it. IVCs is what I typically use, which is fancy way. It's instantaneous velocity center. And you can think of this as it's easiest to think about with a single pivot first or a physical joint first. So what we care about is the relative motion of 2 bodies in this linkage. And we care about it in the manner that we want to understand what is the relative movement between the two, and specifically in a way that's pure rotation. So if we're looking at a single pivot bike, you have a rear swing arm and a front triangle and a main pivot, and it happens to be that instant center or VDP or whatever you want to call it is located at that main pivot, and it's also physically there. You can see it at a joint. And we know that the swing arm is moving in relation to the front triangle about that point. As you jump up to a 4-bar, then you have these more complex relationships. And we know that actually these members that are moving in space can be rotating and translating. And what we want to do is simplify that to say, look at any relative motion between any of the links and understand how those are rotating about each other purely with rotation, no translation. And from there, the reason we care about that is that we're simplifying it so that we can use these pivot points as inputs to dynamics later when we're adding forces. So we care about the relative motion of these 2 members. Mm-hmm. And in particular, what we do from there, so we know we have these instant centers. The instant centers can either be at joints physically, or they can be virtual and they can be moving in space. And that can either be those joints can migrate and move over time, or they can be stationary relative to a frame of reference. And the next thing we can ask ourselves is, well, how many instant centers are in this system? And if we go back in one step previously, where we're like, all right, this is a 1 degree of freedom system, we can go and say, well, how many instant centers are there? And for the case, well, basically there's an equation that's n times n minus 1 divided by 2, which is how many, n is the number of links in that system. And we output how many IVCs are in that system. So if you have a 4-bar, you have 4 times 3 is 12 divided by 2, which is 6. So you have 6 instant centers. You can go to a 6-bar and then you have 15, and you can make that calculation. This is a lot of backend. It'll make sense here in a bit, but the goal of this is that we have many instant centers in this linkage system, but what we actually care about are only a couple relative to the dynamics of the bike. So we care about what the main thing is that we care about is, all right, the wheel is mounted to one of these members, and you have the suspended body, which is your front triangle and yourself and the rider. And we care about the relative motion of what member the wheel is mounted to with respect to the suspended body or the front triangle. We care which member the brake is mounted to with respect to the front triangle, because later on we're going to be using those values of those incident centers to calculate the dynamics like anti-squat and anti-rise.
Mhm.
So although there's many of these instant centers, those are the two that we typically care about. There's more if you get into idlers and things like that. Um, so I guess starting there, that's a bit of a background. What we're trying to do with kinematics is really tune that system or exploit that linkage to have certain migrations of those instant centers that we care about, the one with the wheel and the one with the brake, so that we can create these dynamic behaviors that we care about when you're riding, like anti-squat and anti-rise. And then in addition to that, we're also trying to determine or design the ideal leverage rate. So just kinematically speaking, you have your rear wheel is moving a certain amount and your shock is moving a certain amount. The shock is moving less than the rear wheel.
Mhm.
So you have a mechanical advantage of the linkages providing over the shock. And so we're also tuning the kinematics in order to achieve that specific leverage rate. So the higher the leverage the mechanical system has over the shock, the softer the suspension feels. So again, if you have a big lever arm or a big wrench, it's
Mhm.
going to be easier to tighten that bolt or loosen that bolt. And then the lower, shorter that lever arm is, then the less leverage you have, and the firmer it's going to be. So with kinematics, we are essentially doing two things. We are creating a leverage rate that we're after, and we're also designing the relative motion of the wheel carrier versus the suspended body and the brake carrier versus the suspended body. And that's all essentially kinematics. And then you get into the world of dynamics where you have this value of how these bodies are moving relative to each other.
Mhm.
And now you're introducing forces. So when you're pedaling or you're accelerating, you're introducing forces and accelerations moving forward. And then you can apply those forces relative to these pivot points and get the behavior of the bike. So understand what anti-squat is and what anti-rise is when you're braking. And so that's sort of like the progression. That was long-winded, but I think the reason I kind of mention it is that it's helpful. I think it could be helpful to really break down suspension as an industry in some basic categories. And of course, there's going to be different flavors and tunings of these, but what I mean by that is what you can do is you can start kind of classifying a suspension pretty simply without all that nerdery that we just went through. But for instance, you can say, well, I think the first thing you can do as to get back to your initial question of what are you looking for, what suspension, why, the first thing you can look at is, well, how many members or how many bodies are in the suspension platform that you're looking at. So let's take maybe Yeti ASR as an example. So that is basically technically has four bars. You have your front triangle, you have your chainstay. We'll get into this, but you have your seat stay, and you also have your little dog bone. So it has four bodies or links to it, and we know from that how we have to have 1 degree of freedom. We know how many joints that bike has to have. It has to have four. So we have the main pivot at the chainstay of the front triangle. We have the two pivots on the dog bone up top, so that's three. And we know there has to be a fourth, and in our case, there's a flex pivot on the seat stay and chainstay interface.
Mhm.
And so what you can start to do is actually classify this suspension pretty simply. You can say, number one, how many links are in the system, and there's four. And then you can start talking about things that you care about. So what I mean by that is you have a wheel carrier, a brake carrier, and a leverage rate that maybe are the primary things that we're focused on. And what you can do is you can look at that linkage and say, well, how many links are defining the movement that is tuning that attribute? So let's talk about the wheel. On ASR, your wheel is mounted to the chainstay, and
Mhm.
then it has a main pivot. So you technically have a two bar that's how much you can control the wheel path is just with a two bar system. So the wheel path and actually the caliper is mounted to the chainstay as well. So you technically have a two bar that's controlling your anti squat and your anti rise. And
Okay.
then you get to your shock and how many links are controlling your shock? Well, it's four.
Right.
So you can kind of break it down and say, all right, I have a 4 bar linkage. I have 2 bar control over anti squat. I have 2 bar control over anti rise, and I have 4 bar control over leverage rate. So you can very quickly kind of classify a bike that way. And it doesn't tell you anything about how it's tuned or why. But I think it's a first really good step to say, all right, this is the classification. And then I think it's worth doing maybe one more version where you say, or one or two, but say a Sixfinity bike, also a 4-bar bike, but different in those numbers below. So if you count the bars, you have your front triangle, your swing arm, you actually have your Sixfinity mechanism, and then your upper rocker. And again, we know this has to have 4 pivot points or 4 joints, and there's 2 on the rocker. There's one in the center of the Sixfinity. Those are all revolute joints. We have to have a 4th, and that 4th is the prismatic joint or the linear joint. But if you get to the next classification, it's different than the ASR, and it's different in the way where, all right, what member is the wheel connected to? The wheel is connected to the swing arm. What member is the brake connected to? It's connected to the swing arm. If you remove any of those other linkages, then you'll no longer have a single degree of freedom that's controlling the wheel path. So we know in this case that all 4 members of that linkage are controlling the anti-squat and the anti-rise. And then we can do the same thing with shock, and same thing, actually all 4 are controlling that. So you have a 4-bar linkage that has 4-bar control over anti-squat, 4-bar control over anti-rise, and 4-bar control over leverage rate. So there's like a kind of a relatively like quick way to start comparing things. And it doesn't tell you about the tuning, but it tells you about the capability that's possible for that linkage.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to a 6-bar like Sixfinity, and you actually can do that same study. And just to not talk too much, it's, it ends up being a 6-bar bike, obviously 6-bar control over anti-squat, 6-bar control over anti-rise, and 6-bar control over leverage rate.
Yeah.
And you can look at different models, and I think it's helpful just to look at 6-bars for a second, where, name your other 6-bar out there. Like, I think like the Specialized DH is a good one just to compare to, or just to understand the classification, where you have 6 bars in that bike as well.
Yeah.
You have 4-bar control over your anti-squat and anti-rise, and 6-bar control over your leverage rate. And there's pros and cons of kind of all of those classifications and why you would use them and what your flavor is after. But I think that's like a really good starting point. If you want to get a little bit nerdier of starting your question as a starting point, you'd be like, well, how many bars are there? How many bars are controlling where my wheel is mounted to, and my brake and my shock? And that gives you like a pretty good idea of maybe what the capabilities are. And then we'll kind of go to town from there as to the next set of attributes to why you'd kind of choose one or the other. So sorry, long-winded, but I think that's a bit of a background.
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly does. I mean, and like, obviously everything has an application, right? But and some could probably take away from this, more bars controlling means more ability to tune and separate forces. Right at the very beginning of the conversation, you're saying it's really hard to isolate one force without having something be affected elsewhere, right? So
yeah, it's perfectly described. And you have the more bars, essentially, the more control you have. It doesn't necessarily mean the more independence you have.
Right.
And there's different ways, different goals of why you would choose, having 6-bar control over one thing and 4-bar control over the other. In the case of Sixfinity, we have this ability to tune, with 6-bar control over all those variables, and also in a way that just happens to work really well. So I guess I'd say that in a way where it could certainly work poorly, or having this. It could have worked out, and that's why we landed on it, and where we are is that it does actually solve all those really well together. Where if it didn't, we wouldn't be using it.
Sure, but then again, right, taking it a step further, people shouldn't get wrapped up into more bars equals more control equals more better. An ASR, I can't see what you guys are working on in the future, but I don't imagine an ASR is going to have Sixfinity because it just isn't the right application.
Yeah, there's totally different applications, and what are your, what are you focusing on? What are you trying to optimize? What are the goals, right? So, and actually, I think it's one of the great things about having different systems is, one, we have what we have on the ASR, a simple 4-bar, that we can really optimize for weight and that's a huge part of the optimization, right? And why we chose that specific suspension layout. And we can hit the other variables as closely as we can given that constraint. And then you get to, an e-bike or a longer travel bike. And what we can do with control on Sixfinity, we feel is very, very much worth, that added complexity and weight to get the performance that we're after, also the structural benefits that we're after. So yeah, it's choosing the right flavor of technology and suspension linkage for the application. And even within Sixfinity, we have differences, right? We have our DH bike is also Sixfinity, which is often confused for being a 4-bar just visually, because you can't actually see really easily that center timing link that's actually mounted through the seat tube.
Hmm.
But if you look at the kind of logic and theory behind that bike, it's a lot different than what we're doing on an E. And then our execution of what we're doing with Sixfinity is actually a lot different as well than the E is than a e-bike too. So we
Yeah.
have this a huge amount of tunability and how we can actually take that linkage and optimize it for different directions. So
Yeah.
from e-bike to pedal to downhill, and you name it, we have this tunability that we can optimize for each one of those scenarios.
Okay. So to keep going in here, uh, all 6 bars aren't going to ride the same. All 4 bars aren't going to ride the same, right? I mean, there might
Yeah,
be some similar traits, perhaps, but
yeah.
so let's continue down this process, right? The consumer has identified, okay, this system has this many bars, this is controlling this many
Mhm.
features. Like, what what's the next step of being like, okay, so does every 4 bar going to ride the same because it has the same number of bodies
Yeah.
controlling?
Yeah, and that's like the big next step, right? So there's, I think that what I mentioned on the classification side that we went through that study, I think it's helpful as just like a good way to maybe talk about it as an industry or compare from a top level. But I want to be cautious that it doesn't mean good or bad or uh, you need to have these numbers to have the most ideal scenario.
Right.
It gives you a bracket to kind of compare to one to the other, to understand maybe the motivations of that linkage or that brand. And then from there, you can execute each one of those, especially when you get to a 6-bar, because you have more links and more variables. You actually can tune yourself in the very wrong way even faster. So it's one of those things that the next step is really, I think, up to it's helpful from the manufacturer side to maybe give some of that information to give where they're coming from. What are these dynamic curves that we haven't even talked about yet? But anti-squat and anti-rise, leverage rate, these different you know curves that we're looking at from the system. What do those look like next? And I think that's the next phase that I the process that I take when I go through it. I first just visually look at what we just described on classification, and then, I have some intuition of what those might do from a curve standpoint, but I'll have to really map those out to really fully understand it of what's occurring. And so there's a ton of detail that you can get into maybe what you're looking for there. But I think maybe the easiest way is to talk about our own bikes and maybe what our theory is. And there's different theories, different flavors, different ideals, I should say, of what someone is after based off of their riding style and terrain and so on. So for us, the next phase that I would look at or for myself would be like, all right, what do these anti-squat curves look like as a starting point for one of the variables? And from our perspective and what our logic and what we're going for, again, it's different on how we're tuning these, both magnitude, mostly magnitude, but some shape as we change from an e-bike to a pedal or to a downhill bike, for example. But we have that ability to do that with the system. And so the first thing that we look at generally is the shape of that curve. So what we feel is ideal and what we're after logically is that we want to have a higher anti-squat again in the beginning of the travel or where you're around sag. And then we want to have that anti-squat drop off really quickly. And the magnitude, the percentage or what that value is going to be different depending on the bike we're designing. So it could be travel, it could be a power input, kind of what we're biasing, or we're biasing efficiency or traction. And we can make these decisions and have that ability to tune. So in short, I'd say what we're generally doing is we're looking at the power input of the bike. And we know with an e-bike, there is obviously assist that's occurring with the motor. And so you can kind of classify these vehicles into something that's power limited or something that's traction limited. And in the case of like a moto or a smaller version of that, as you go into power on an e-bike, you really aren't you're not limited by the power. You have this assist of the motor, and you're more limited by traction.
Mhm.
And so we're biasing these percentages of these anti-squat curves slightly lower, which is a bit maybe against your intuition, but lower to focus on traction for those particular scenarios, and
Yeah,
lean a little bit less on general efficiency because we can get through it with the motor just fine. But
yeah,
on a pedal bike, it's sort of the opposite. You're limited by power. You yourself are the engine. You want to eke out as much efficiency as you can without
sure.
being detrimental. And we want to have that as an optimization and a different feel. So inherently, you're going to have a different feel between that e-bike, not only because of weight distribution, but also because of the different power inputs.
Yeah.
And so we are tuning those differently. But generally speaking, a pedaling platform in the beginning and then a drop of that pedaling platform later is what we're going for on our side.
Would you say that drop off, like you said, like any squat on LT versus SB160s are relatively similar,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd say the bikes do feel quite a bit different.
Yeah.
Is that because of the drop off right after? And would you say most brands have a very similar concept or theory in how fast it drops off once you get beyond sag?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to that first question is, and that's a whole can of worms, honestly. So it's really interesting looking at these variables that we are kind of using as a baseline, like again, anti squat, anti rise, leverage rate, and you can have two bikes that have identical or nearly identical curve. I can say identical curves, but behave quite a bit differently. And there's more to the equation than just those curves that's happening dynamically. A lot of that has to do with this instant centers that we were describing before and how they're moving and they're migrating.
Mm,
I think one interesting point there is so Switchfinity and Sixfinity, as I mentioned, have very, very similar shapes and magnitudes of anti-squat on, say, on the LT versus the 160. They're really actually very similar.
yeah.
And then those two same bikes or those comparison have actually very different anti-rise values. So one just quick interesting thing is you can have two bikes that have an identical anti-squat and a very, very different anti-rise. And that's just kind of, we don't need to go into the details as to why, but it's an interesting fact that you can have that. And then even within the same anti-squat value, it doesn't mean that the migration of your instant centers and how the linkage is rotating relative to each other is the same. Because all that you're looking at is this vector and this angle, this vector that can be identical, but there's other attributes of that linkage that are different. And so, as going back to the other part of our conversation, where this kind of quantitative and qualitative feel of, hey, these things have very similar anti-squat values, but different linkage mechanics that are also inputting how the bike is feeling overall. And so, like one particular attribute might be, I think it's pretty consistent on the feel of an LT, say, versus a 160, is just having better square edge compliance. And if you look at that bike and you look at the curves, you'd be like, well, why? And there's some kind of thoughts on our side as to theory as to why. I probably won't get into as deep, but there's more, there's maybe more to it than just these, all these tools that we're using are pretty simplified. We're
Yeah.
looking at anti-squat. If it is more complicated, it would just be a bag of weeds and too much to discuss. So you kind
Yeah.
of simplify it to an amount that is helpful to compare. And then you have this whole other side of other theory in the background of what might be happening, and then the qualitative side to it, and trying to relate all those things. And so, yeah, I guess it's really interesting. And even on our own side, when we use these as a baseline of, hey, these curves are similar, why would we tune one differently? Well, there's other kind of back end things that are occurring as to maybe why some of these behaviors are felt in that instance.
Yeah. And because I guess from there's, and again, the wormhole just keeps getting deeper as we dig, right?
Yeah.
Fox has a new shock, right? So I imagine there's got to be a small performance improvement in there. Chainstay lengths, right, are things that can be different. Wheel path, like all of these things are not taking into account anti-squat, anti-rise, right? So is it kind of like a sum of all these parts that are working together?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think, like you said, you can dig in kind of as deep as you want, and also you're making assumptions during that digging, of course.
Right.
And I think time and kind of experience is really what kind of helps resolve all of those things. But for sure, like we have these theories on how each one of those things are impacting the bike as a whole. So, we went into a little bit of a rabbit hole on kinematics, but you have geometry as a whole. We haven't even talked about damping or shock tuning.
Yeah.
You have structure that is going to impact how the bike's stiffness is and how it's feeling. You have,
Yeah.
super in deep on the damping side as well. So it's a big giant puzzle, and that's what keeps it fun and always
Yeah.
different. And that's the funny thing about bikes and cool thing about bikes too, is that it's you have this science and this direction that you are feeling that you want to go as a company, as a crew, and it's really biased and selfish and kind of what we want. And
Hmm.
then from there it's there's so much fine tuning and different angles you can take as to maybe what how
Yeah.
that bike can be tuned, and that kind of jumps into adjustments on the LT maybe compared to what we've done in the past. And in addition to this baseline that we're discussing of what the frame is doing, there's a lot more adjustments that you can
Yeah.
add to it that for better there's pros and cons of that. And maybe I would start, and historically we haven't done as many adjustments if you look at like our 160 and so on. And there's again pros and cons to it. So the what we've done, I guess our approach in the past is really having fewer adjustments and just kind of nailing what we think is ideal, and less user adjustability at the end. And so I think you get maybe more optimization for the structure. You don't have this complexity of all these things that you can try. But those are the pros of having adjustments, and I think we recognize that people have different styles, again, different terrain, different suspension that they're going to be putting on the bike, and you can get yourself into a better position by having these adjustments. Of course,
Yeah.
I think you can go the wrong direction, um, but it's really offering that customer, that rider, to tailor it and tinker kind of as much as they want,
Yeah.
to get to a solution that might be ideal for them.
Man, it's crazy that the longer we go and talk, and I mean, having a highly educated person who's an expert in this field, you're essentially validating like what we do in our testing process, right? Very often we'll get a new bike and we will not look at a geo chart. We will not look at suspension kinematics. We will
Yep.
not dive into all of these rates and details. And people will ask us, "Oh man, that's the new bike. What's it got? What's this? What's that?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know what the
Yeah.
reach is, because, and it's a question that we get from so many people asking us about which bike should I get, this, that. Oh, I really want this bike, but it has this whatever rate, or it has this reach,
Yep.
or, and we tell people so often, it's like, hey, there's so much more to a bike than what the chart says, and like you're validating that exact fact that like, okay, yeah, you can look at an anti-rise chart that tells you one gear at sag what the bike's doing in this scenario, and you could have, you know, a Sixfinity equipped LT, right? And a nearly identical 6-bar bike with the same travel, and almost identical geo from another brand, and those two bikes could ride very differently based on like carbon layup, right? I mean, just the carbon, like the frame stiffness, and what shock tune that they developed could give you two drastically different feeling bikes out on the trail, right?
100%. It's there's so many variables into the end feel, and then obviously there's, as you kind of mentioned, some biases that you might be introducing into your experience, as well as like this is a number that I heard from somewhere that it should be the
Yeah.
one I'm looking for. But man, the reality is like, and I think that responsibility ends up being on us. Quite a bit, where there's a ton of nuance and there's a ton of time that we take into experiencing all these different adjustments or these different tunes, and from shock tuning to kinematics to structure, and is it going to be right for everyone? No, and it shouldn't be, and that's what keeps it fun. I mean, everyone's doing their own flavor, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
but is it what we have for that particular moment in time kind of optimize and determine what we think is best for our flavor? Yeah, for sure. And is it going to be the same next year or the year after? Maybe
Who
some of the
knows?
core values, but we're learning all the time. And I try to stress this a lot is, and I try to stay humble there where, you can be doing this for a long time and it'll be till the day I die that I'm still learning and figuring out things that are different or better understanding it or having a different idea or a way to articulate it. And I think that's what keeps it really fun is this continuous progress of learning and better understanding. And that's what keeps it really fun. And also just like that curiousness of, how can we improve and what can be different and why, and you kind of just keep digging, and year after year I think you can see those improvements from kinematics to structure to manufacturing, all those different things. It just builds on, I mean, ideally is the way it should be, is you kind of you don't repeat any losses or things that weren't working well, and you keep the things that were, and then you just keep building.
Yeah.
And it's a never ending process. It doesn't
Yeah.
ever end.
Always evolving. Um, Something I would like to ask about just in my personal testing and seeking for education, right? I know, I'm assuming that rider weight has a bearing on feel over different suspension platforms, right? I know that in the past, there have been bikes that I feel are a little stiffer than I would like or a little too harsh. And then another rider will get on who's 25, 35 pounds heavier than me. And he's like, I didn't feel that. Similarly on the LT, I, excuse me, I was talking with Dario recently. And, he used
Mhm.
to work with
Yeah.
us and he's now a Pink Bike. But so we've ridden together a fair bit. He's lighter than I am. I think he's like maybe 160 ish, maybe 165. And I'm like 190, 195. But he's riding it in the 20% leverage spot, which is what I'm at.
Hmm.
And we both love the bike, but he's like, I'm just trying to find a way to make it a little more comfortable. It's just a
Hmm.
little stiff for me. And I'm like, man, that's crazy. I've often said Yeti bikes are not that comfortable for me because they're a little too stiff and chattery, but I thought the LT was dialed. I think it's so comfortable and has a great blend of feel, but we're both running it at 20%. I think he may be running it in mullet a little bit more frequently. He said he's ridden both, so I'm sure the smaller wheel has a little bit to do with some of that. But
Yeah.
am I at 195 just able to feel a little bit of a softer suspension feel? Is it the terrain that I'm riding here, like the rocky, rough, chattery stuff at high speeds versus him
Hmm.
riding roots in Bellingham? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think those there's like you said, there's so many variables there. Even kind of your own
Tire
ideal
pressure,
of
maybe.
of, of kind of what your sensation that you're after. I think all those things kind of add up. Where you're riding, it's tough to narrow it down to like one variable that might be the difference that you're describing as to the sensation that Dario's feeling versus yourself. I think also too, like there's add another element to it. There's size specific tuning that's going on as well, and
Yeah,
there's some
he's on an
variance
XL.
there. And there's also like I think there's a portion that's worth discussing where you have the intent of that LT obviously is going to be a race bike on our side. People are going to use it for other intentions as well, but you're going to be using it for I love using that bike for actually big long rides and climbing as well. And so there's different goals of kind of maybe what your riding is. And like I think a comparison to the e-bikes, they're kind of on purpose going for a different feel there. So and also just by nature of what's occurring with weight distribution and power input and so on, they're just different flavors again. Whereas like I think on the e-bike you have this weight distribution, this added weight that is giving you some of that sensation of that softer, plusher feel.
Hmm.
And on for racing, it's not necessarily always the fastest way to get down. Isn't always comfort. And
Yeah.
so there's some relationship there and trade off as to what you're after and what your goals are.
Right.
And then plus your own subjective side of what you're feeling. So it's a long working around the answer a little bit, but it's tough to nail down those variables of what someone's feeling or where their train is and add it up to a single reason as
Yeah.
to maybe what their perspective is. But there's a ton of tunability and in what you can do on that LT from like you said, rate to geometry, and those are a lot of levers you can kind of play with if you're riding Bellingham all the time, or Whistler and it's super steep, and that's kind of the terrain you're after is going to be quite a bit different than the goal of probably riding here in Colorado. So you do have a lot of options to tune accordingly.
Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, it's like, I do think there is a distinct difference in feel and also what we're going for tuning as well, but between an e-bike and a pedal bike as well. And I think,
Sure.
a lot of people, it depends on what your preference is, but, those, our MTE and our LT are incredible. I mean, like both of those, MT in particular, just, I love that bike. And
Yeah.
for
Same.
me, being, there's different classifications of obviously what type of rider. Not the fastest rider out there. I prefer kind of traction and comfort, and that gives me confidence, and then I have more fun.
Yeah.
That's kind of like maybe the way I'd classify myself as a rider and what I'm after. And for me, that fit on the MT is just perfect.
Yeah.
Like I gain so much confidence and ability to,
Good.
stay on track with that added weight, and I'm almost choosing that bike more for the descent than I am for the
Yeah.
climbing, which is kind of funny because it's an e-bike, but
It's fair.
it's the way that I describe it is just that, and that I'm typically choosing that bike actually for the descent, and I'm using it for climbing, and I'm putting kind of a similar effort, but I'm just sort of canceling out the weight to get the same experience as call it a trail bike or an enduro bike, but
Yeah.
I gain kind of that feel, maybe that you're, maybe Dario's even after, that you can get in that specific platform. But it's also, I think to some degree, if our LT rode exactly the same as the LTE, one again, they're very different inputs and
Yeah.
different goals. And I think what we're trying to do is make and tune that specific suspension for the scenario that we think is maybe most appropriate. Could we make it into a cloud and the softest thing ever? We could tune more towards that direction, but is it going to be the fastest and maybe the best scenario for the other attributes we're after? Maybe not. So it's always sort of a set of balances and goals that you're after for the experience, and maybe in that particular case doesn't align as well as maybe yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So then if you were to, I guess, say, if one rider was on the same size bike, right?
Yeah.
And one rider was 160 pounds and another and felt the bike was stiff and harsh with the same amount of sag, same shock settings, and a
Mhm.
210-pound rider got on it, would that added weight potentially make the bike not feel as stiff to a heavier
Yeah.
rider?
I
Or would
mean,
it be
weight alone,
the same?
of course, is a variable, but like we have a pretty big range in how we're designing the internals of that damper and the tuning to compensate for a pretty wide
Sure.
range of weight.
Mhm.
Of course, there's sort of the speed and
Yeah.
portion of maybe the skill level and train that kind of added to it as well. So, for shock tuning and the damping side, I mean that you can get so very specific on what you're after and tune very drastically different for maybe I would maybe describe that as a way to really move yourself in a different direction for the same category of weight is obviously your mechanical system and linkage is what it is, and for those drastic feels and difference in change and that you're describing on plushness or softness, whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
I think that next level there is then tuning specifically for the feel that you're after.
Okay. Um, and moving into like your new range of bikes that have so much adjustability here, and I'm going to specifically talk about your progression or your leverage rate chips, right? I think it's 15, 20, 25 on most all of them.
Correct.
Um,
Well,
for
on
a,
the LT,
yeah, yeah. So for riders who are looking to play or modify how their bike feels, and they're maybe looking for advice on end of stroke feel that they want to
yeah.
change or beginning stroke feel. Can you talk about when they would maybe use a volume reducer and when they would maybe change the chips?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's kind of a lot we can talk about there, but the first thing you noted is as we change that chip location, we are changing the percentage progression. So I think it's helpful to understand what that means. First of all, if I'm just looking at the curve. So the first thing we do when you look at a leverage rate curve is you look at the shape of it, and you maybe ignore everything else for a little bit. Is it a straight line? Is it at an angle? Is it parabolic? Whatever it might be. And one of our focuses is to really lean more towards a linear curve, meaning not to be confused with linear progression or no progression, but the actual R squared value, or how straight that curve is. And we look at that because it's helpful in a few different ways. One, you have consistency. So you have this change in progression that's consistent, and that often leads to predictability, and you can understand where you are in the travel. There's not like this weird sudden change of progression that's occurring in certain scenarios. You
Yeah.
have really a predictable and consistent feel. And that linear shape also helps with tunability on the damping side. So yeah, again, if you have a really quick undulation or sudden change in that curve, it can be tough to tune for all the scenarios that you're after. So the beginning of the
Right.
stroke and the end of the stroke. And so the next thing that you're looking at is the progression, and that is that slope of that curve. So the more progression, the more slope. And so you can look at leverage rate or motion ratio. We typically look at leverage rate on our side, and it is so it's a negative slope curve. So the higher that curve is, or that point on the curve, the more leverage that the mechanical linkage has over the shock, and so the softer the bike feels. The lower that value is the opposite, the less mechanical advantage and the firmer the bike feels.
Uh-huh.
And so there's two things that are important, and those curves, so from 15, 20, and 25%, say on the LT, 15 is the least slope. And then as you go to 25, it has more slope and starts higher and ends lower. And you can start there, where if you just go basic, starting higher and ending lower, well, starting higher means it's going to be softer in the beginning, and ending lower means it's going to be firmer at the end. But I think what's often lost in kind of the intuition there is that slope, the connection between the two. So it not only means that you're ending up firmer, but you're getting firmer quicker.
Yeah.
It's that rate of change that really is what I think you feel probably maybe the most. And so there's, I guess there's no wrong or right answer as to the progression that you prefer. But I do think that there's some maybe confusion of to why you choose one, like maybe what you're getting after and why you choose the other. And sometimes there gets intuition, but I would generally describe it as if you have more progression, I typically think that's helpful for maybe more of a park ride, right? So if you're interested in having a super plush feel at the top, and you also want to be able to push into the bike's spring rate, or that progression that we're just describing, to give you more pop and playfulness when you're jumping and things like that. You get kind of, those are maybe the attributes that you're after, is soft off the top and then a quick ramp up to give yourself this ability to push off of and jump around and be playful. Whereas the opposite spectrum, the more linear or lower progression, I just contradicted my goal of not saying linear because I don't like confusing those two. But when you have a lower progression, we typically see that scenario more from the racing side, where they're actually wanting sort of more mid-stroke support, but also that ramping isn't occurring so fast. They don't want it so soft off the top. It's just more controlled and more consistent. They can get feedback from the trail and understand where they are. And those are the kind of attributes you be going for on that side. But again, there's kind of no wrong or right answer. And for me, it actually changes depending on e-bike or pedal. But
Yeah.
I often kind of can relate. And I mean this in the nicest way possible for everyone, but like, I'm not the best rider in the world, and I can see benefits of having more progression in certain scenarios, and that I it's a bit more of a couch feel in some, to some degree, and giving you some confidence there. But I also have experiences with too much progression where it just feels like you're hitting a wall really
Yeah.
quickly, and it's firmer that way. So it can
Yeah.
be a bit against your intuition, where you're like, oh, the soft off the top and really firm is kind of giving you that couch type feel, where actually a lower rate is doesn't have that, literally doesn't have as much progression, and that change of ramp up is slower, or isn't occurring as fast. So you actually have more kind of consistency and plushness, if you will, because you're not hitting that one ramp up.
Yeah, it's an interesting like battle to try to find for me, right? Like as a rider who does suffer with fatigue, on long descents and riding, I prefer rough, rocky, loose, dry terrain. Like, and again, like I'm trying to go faster. I'm trying to get corners. I'm trying to, float over stuff, and so I want a bike that really reacts and, keeps traction when I need it. But I also love finding just little things to just pop and yank off of to find natural gaps and transitions. But,
Yeah.
then there are times where I have found myself getting more fatigued on bikes where I'm like, and I'm just going softer and softer, or you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
and it's just like, oh, it's because I'm just hitting that wall where
Yeah.
the ramp up happens, and and I'm just not going through the travel, so I'm just hitting that hard wall, and then
Yeah.
that's causing the fatigue, and like, so it's a really interesting thing to play with and
Yeah.
to always try to be learning and getting out of your like, oh, this is what I have to do because this is what I like, or this is what's
Yeah.
worked for me, because it has changed and it's evolved as shocks have changed, as suspension kinematics, bike geometry and lengths have changed, right?
Hmm.
Chainstay lengths change, like things move, and it's like something that like I know I personally reached out to you with on like, man, I really love that touchdown feeling, that pillowy feel of the LT. I think it's comfortable. I like the way that it plows through stuff roughly, but I feel like I'm using like too much travel too frequently.
Yeah.
So I'm like, should I play with a chip or should I add a band? Because like I've added more compression, which has helped some, but then all of a sudden it starts getting stiffer and taking away some of the sensitivity I like. So, like even myself, I'm struggling with like, well, oh, it's just a matter of time playing
Yeah.
with all the options.
I mean, I guess, yeah, a couple things there. I'd say like, the first thing is that when we make mules prior to production on these bikes, we test a really huge range of progression. So, like, picture that the chip that's located on the LT for adjusting progression. We have one that's like 4 times bigger, maybe not quite that, but it's a lot bigger. So we can try
Mhm.
this huge range, and we end up getting to what we feel is an appropriate range. And I do think that there's sort of a sentiment that more progression is better. And I definitely think to be very cautious in saying that. I just don't agree with that at all. I think there's a time for more progression and a time for less. And I'd say generally speaking, from a kinematic point, when we get to this previous conversation of designing bikes and all these different things we're balancing, it's way, way, way easier to get a bike that has a ton of progression with all
Yeah,
the other variables that you're after.
yeah,
And so it can often, I think, be a default because you're like, oh, I hit this variable and this variable, and man, I have this super progressive leverage rate suite. But oftentimes it's sort of easier to get there. And I don't necessarily think it's the right answer in all scenarios. And in fact, I think it can be pretty detrimental in some cases as well. So I think the thought there is that, with this adjustment that we have, it's at least tangible. So we wanted to make this adjustment so it wasn't like a really small change. It was enough to change that you could actually tell a difference.
yeah.
And I think it really just takes fiddling, and it's really fast to change, right? You can
Yeah.
change that in 2 seconds. And I think your brain can really better comprehend what those curves mean just by trying that real quick. So
Mhm.
it's I think the trial and error of just being like, all right, this is a sensation of less progression, this is a sensation of more. Maybe you can help after you experience that. Then I think you can better relate that to why this might be good in some scenarios and why it might be the other one might be good in these other scenarios. And it's really just making experimenting and trying uh, you know all those scenarios and seeing what you prefer for your particular goal that you're after.
Yeah. And I mean, something that maybe I would impart too with people, whether it's a Yeti or any other bike, right? Um, Chainstay length adjustments, wheel size adjustment as well, I believe, and
Yeah,
leverage rate. Those are all going to require you to reassess your sag and your air pressure and your shock, correct?
they will. Yeah, and so it is. I think of it like an LT. There are a lot of adjustment. And I think to go back and just think logically through that is, that's the bike that outside of a downhill bike where we're going to likely be racing in scenarios, at least on our side. Doesn't mean that everyone has to use it for racing, but we know that there's going to be different tracks and different terrain and different riders, even within our team, of what they're after. So there's a lot of adjustment there that can be tuned per race, can be tuned per rider on the team, can be tuned per shock choice, all these different things. But yes, of course, each one of those changes that you have is going to impact your setup and your shock tuning and all those things. And it's something that we do, at least on our shock tuning app that we have on our site, that actually is really helpful to get you into a great starting point where
Uh-huh.
if you are in this particular scenario of this rate on the LT, we recommend these starting positions of sag and so on. So we give a good baseline that we actually put a lot of effort into. It's not just maybe a scientific method of determining those values. It's a lot of testing and testing of
Yeah.
different riders, different size to get us into what we feel is a good recommendation. So yeah, a lot to tune there and adjust accordingly. And then, as you mentioned too, on the geometry side, rear center, front center, that's obviously been a big focus on the LT and kind of our when we were doing development on the LT and the mule that we were developed prior, we had this just obnoxious ability to change rear center to obviously a too long position, and it's been a really interesting, especially for me being a taller rider and understanding, if I look back in time, like the progression of kind of industry geometry and where we were on our say our 160 and previous bikes, and front centers and head angles, maybe front centers are getting longer, head angles are getting slacker, but nothing was happening or occurring as much on the rear end. And Sixfinity really gives this opportunity to play with that a ton.
Mhm.
And when we were doing changes on, say, the 160, you're just more limited for a few reasons on how much adjustment you can make per size,
Yeah.
while keeping, say in that case you have a rigid swing arm, while keeping the same swing arm. We are
Yeah.
adjusting that rear center by by front triangle hard point location. So that's how we're actually adjusting the rear center. The swing arm is the same.
Got it.
And when you get to Sixfinity, we have this whole other ability to tune even further. So um, the reason why is a couple, I guess, twofold. One is that there's more linkages that are breaking up this bike into components, and so we can. In the case of the LT, we actually switch out the seat stay and the chain stay for sizes large and extra large to give more ability to tune further. But we're also tuning each one of these hard point positions in the front triangle per size as well, and we can do it more drastically than we can do with a rigid swing arm. So we have kind of two different levers that are occurring. We can utilize a lot of the same linkages, but reposition their hard points, and not only just like move them rearward.
Uh-huh.
They're actually tuned not only for geometry, but also tuned specifically for that size for kinematics. So we're looking
Okay.
differently at anti-squat and anti-rise and positioning those. If you were to overlay a small, a medium, a large, and extra large, nothing lines up. Like they're
Yeah.
all different.
Sure.
But they are using some of the same linkages. So they're using the same rocker, same timing link, same lower link in the case of the LT. And then the seat stay, yet some other members are being changed on the bigger sizes that give us even more adjustment. So
Okay.
we have, like, because that linkage is broken into more parts, we can actually tune more specifically per size as a result, not only geometrically but kinematically. So we can have these bigger jumps in rear center that we couldn't have had previously. And when we did a lot of our ride testing, and I think a lot of us went into it like, I think the intuition, and it's fun when your intuition is wrong, just because it's just interesting. But like, a lot of our intuition was like, all right, this is going to be, when we try these longer ones, it's going to ride like a limousine, right? It's just going to be long and crazy. And especially like for myself being an extra large guy, the difference was so, I guess my experience was so opposite of that, which is really interesting. And the attributes that I would kind of attribute to that, or not the same word, but what I would basically, how I would explain that or describe it would be, when you have, let's look at a 160 for a comparison. So, when I rode that bike, I always really had to be pretty focused on telling myself mentally to be over the front of that bike,
Mhm.
to weight the front. And an exercise extra large. And, when I was weighting the front, it was awesome. But the second I got tired or lazy and I kind of leaned back and I wasn't weighting the front, it kind of take me for a ride.
Hmm.
And sort of a similar experience climbing to some degree, where like, man, if I was on it, it was just amazing. But there's the moments where my window of kind of the sweet
Hmm.
spot of where my body position needed to be climbing or descending was really narrow. Like,
Yeah.
in order to get the front weighted properly. And as we go to these longer rear centers, especially on the bigger sizes, I think essentially what we found is our maybe the small and medium, for just generally speaking, we're closer to what we feel that balance was correct. Whereas you get to the large and the extra large, it's less so, where we needed
Yeah.
to make a bigger adjustment on the rear center. And what it results in for me is having this huge sweet spot of body position, both climbing
Yeah.
and descending. Maybe I'll start descending. So on the descending side, I can be so like have so much more freedom of where I can be postured, uh, and still have front end grip and cornering ability that I never experienced before in the past. And so I also like to, so just generally speaking, I just have more better cornering and more control and like an incredibly more amount of confidence. And so that confidence portion I think is important to talk about because it is a real reason why I don't have. I think the sensation of like or intuition that it's going to be slow and I can't do switchbacks or whatever it might be in your mind is or not playful is the exact opposite for me, and it's opposite for me because I have so much more confidence to put myself in these scenarios descending that I would have just never even considered. Like I'll
Yeah.
get into these scenarios that I would have been super scared and not confident. And now I just the opposite. And I have so much more fun and I'm so much more playful as a result of that confidence.
Yeah.
And then on the climbing portion, it's similar in the same way where you just have this bigger window of the sweet spot of your posture, and
Right.
it's actually less tiring because I don't have to like get to a technical
Physically.
section, and yeah, you
Yeah.
have to
Think
weight the
about
front,
it.
but I don't have to like exaggerate it as much. And in the end, it actually makes it less tiring,
Yeah.
where I can kind of like push through sections just by willpower and climbing and putting pedals down versus like really being
Yeah.
articulate over the front. So that's been a really interesting thing on rear center and that experience of maybe what that ratio does for each size.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap things up here. I got a couple of rapid fire questions for you.
Yeah, it's it.
Is pedal kickback real?
Oh, that's a fun one. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a interesting one, just generally speaking, of kind of like confusion. But I would say the very quick answer I'd say is yes. It is real. I think the where things get gray and there's confusion is that it really depends on the scenario and when it's something that you're going to feel, and also on top of that, when it might be negative and when it might be positive. And so I think that's the confusion. I think one thing that you hear is like, okay, if you're going a certain speed, your chain growth can't actually keep up with your hub, and so it doesn't do anything. And I would agree. I think that is true. I think that the thing to discuss is that that's not always true. You're not always going at that speed, and so there's riding a bike is very unsteady state. You're not always in this same scenario.
Mhm.
There's times where even when you're going fast, maybe you're hitting bumps and your wheel is stopping and you're braking at certain times, or there's scenarios where you're certainly not going fast enough for your hub to compensate for that chain growth. And maybe that's a good thing to start there. Is like if you just go to the basics and you forget about you keep the model as simple as possible and you say, well, what is pedal kickback generally? And I think that's a good place to start. And if you just have a line or a distance from we'll ignore idlers for now or high pivot stuff, but if you have a line from your crank axis to your rear wheel and you look at that distance or that line in the extended state and the compressed state, they're not the same length. So
Yeah.
they're generally speaking, it's going to be longer when the bike is compressed.
Mhm.
And so you have to think about, well, what happens to the system if your chain is rigid on the top section, but it's growing in length? What happens to the system? And that's where things get really messy in terms of a mountain bike and the scenarios that we're discussing. It's not steady state, and so is the rear wheel slipping, and is that what's occurring? Is the um, you know um, is the hub rotating, wheel rotating fast enough where that chain growth doesn't matter? Are you getting pedal kickback, meaning that chain tension has to go somewhere? Is it just simply moving your cranks and rotating upwards? And I think reality is a combination of all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. Yeah, the answer is it real? Yes. When does it occur? Different all sorts of different times and different scenarios. And is it bad? Well, maybe sometimes yes, and maybe sometimes no.
Okay.
So I think that's why it's a fun topic and something that we're still learning and understanding better over time too. But the answer is it's a messy answer that people don't want. They want to hear chain or pedal kickback is bad. Let's solve it with this thing. But I think there's also a lot more.
To
A
it than
lot
that.
more to it than just that answer.
Yeah.
And then maybe one thing to add to that is that with Switchfinity and Sixfinity, essentially we have a position sensitive linkage that is helping with that scenario. So you have, higher growth. Again, they're not one to one, so not to be confused that anti-squat equals pedal kickback, because it doesn't always. And actually, usually oftentimes it's the opposite. But the point is that we are actually putting effort into making that mechanical linkage of the suspension mitigate that amount of pedal kickback that you have in scenarios that you don't want to have it. So, but you also don't have maybe some of the negatives that you could potentially have on a device, say for climbing, right? So we have higher, the higher anti-squat in the beginning, and then that anti-squat drops off really quickly. And again, there's some correlation, but not all correlation to pedal kickback, but that drop off is actually helping some of that kickback
Yeah.
that is there too. So we are taking steps or design steps and executions to minimize that.
Okay.
But we also actually want to use it where it's helpful. And I think
Yeah.
there's some fun theoretical thoughts of, when is it helpful? And, I certainly want to have that pedaling platform when I'm climbing. And if
Yeah.
I lost it completely, and I've, ridden certain devices where you do, and it's not in my, I don't really enjoy it on the climbing side.
Yeah. For sure.
Descending may be a different flavor, but there's also benefits to having that. I think on the descending side too. Not always, but like you can gain some
Some
mid-stroke
cases.
support by having control with your chain.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit less comfortable in certain scenarios, but perhaps it's faster in certain scenarios.
Okay.
Anyways, it's a bit of a. There's lots of different answers depending on what
Yeah.
attribute area you're talking about.
Fair enough. All right. So you are going to be banished somewhere. You got to spend the rest of your life in that place. Where are you going, and what bike are you taking?
That's a fun one. So one place to ride your bike, and that you're
Correct.
stuck there.
Yep.
Um,
And there is a solar powered generator, so you can select an
okay.
e-bike.
All right. Sweet. Yeah. I mean, I think the tough part about that is that part of the fun bikes is experiencing these new locations and the different terrain and, even cultures and foods and things like that. And then maybe to add to that is that there's a lot of places I haven't been and I haven't ridden. So maybe there's this place that exists that would
I've
be the
not yet been.
perfect answer for that. So I guess I would answer that in my answer would probably change if you ask me again later in my life. But for now, I would answer that. So I had a chance to go to Madeira in Portugal on one of the Yeti gatherings that we do internationally, and I think that's where I would choose today.
Okay.
And the reason why I choose that today is because if you've ever been there, it's incredibly diverse. Like
Mhm.
from the top of the island to when you get to the bottom, you kind of hit like 10 different microclimates of
Yeah.
terrain. So you have like roots and trees and muddy mess, and then you get to like hub deep moon dust, and then you can get to technical rocks. You kind of hit everything. So
Yeah.
and it's incredibly beautiful and awesome. So I would say right now I would choose there because
Okay.
of that diversity of all the different trails that I've hit.
Yeah. And what bike
Um,
you taking?
MT, easy for me. Yeah.
The shortest answer of the day.
Yeah, I think for all the scenarios for me, I just love that bike for,
Okay.
if I'm stuck there and I'm going to be riding
Uh,
all the time, I can enjoy the climbs and get the
yeah.
benefits out of the E that I enjoy on the descents. And I just get along really well with that bike, and
Yeah.
for my particular flavor as we kind of been talking about. For me, it's a perfect fit. So easy one for me, MTE all day.
I would probably pick that one as well out of the Yeti lineup, I think. So
nice.
Right on, Stretch. Well, thank you so much, man. I appreciate the time. I know we spent a little longer than the hour we were shooting for, but that's all right. We had some good stuff going in there. So thanks again. Man. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, and hopefully it wasn't too boring or nerdy, but it's just sort of the direction I usually end up going. So I appreciate it.
Isaac, you might have just climbed to the top step of the podium there. So.
Awesome. Well,
thanks, buddy. Hopefully we'll see you soon, man.
Thanks, Ben. Later, dude.
Yeah.
Cheers.